When we think about the civil rights movement, we think of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Ruby Bridges, Rosa Parks. These people shaped history. But there were so many more people who helped with the civil rights movement, some of whom we may never know the names of. But it's an important part of history, and one we must never forget. And one of the names we must never forget is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Townsend was born on October 6, 1917. Her parents were James and Luella Townsend, and Fannie Lou was the youngest of 20 children. Her family lived in Montgomery County, Mississippi, and worked on a plantation as sharecroppers. Fannie Lou started working in the fields at the age of 6 and dropped out of school when she was 12 to work full-time and help support her family. Even with that extra support, finances were low. However, even with little education, Fannie Lou had learned to read very well. She was married in 1944 to Perry Hamer, also known as Pap. With her husband, Hamer adopted 4 children, all girls, and was a loving and caring mother. Hamer's health was never the best. She had polio as a child, and the reason for her death was breast cancer. And so around 1961, they found that she had a tumor, and they're like, this needs to be removed. And the doctor in charge of that procedure was white, and he ended up giving her a hysterectomy without her consent or knowledge until after the fact, which meant she wasn't able to have kids. And that was done a lot in those days to Black women, which is not okay. It was done to decrease the African American population. Hamer and Pap both worked on a plantation in Montgomery County, Mississippi, owned by a man named B.D. Marlowe. Because Hamer could read and write, she was not only a sharecropper, but also a timekeeper. It was in the summer of 1962 when Hamer attended a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, help meeting. This meeting was led by civil rights activist James Foreman, who belonged to SNCC, and James Bevel from SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This meeting encouraged African Americans to register to vote. So around this time, African Americans technically had the right to vote. However, some of the states, including southern states especially, found ways around this technicality. They could charge poll taxes, they could give literacy tests, whatever could keep African Americans away from the polls. And so Hamer didn't even know at this time that she was allowed to vote. And so this meeting with SNCC led her to realizing that she could do something about this. This was kind of her moment to start making a change. Hamer and 17 other volunteers traveled to Indianola to register to vote in the county courthouse. Only 2 out of the 18, Hamer and another man, were even allowed to try to register. They were given a literacy test. For the literacy test, they were given a part of the Constitution for Mississippi to interpret. The task was practically impossible and super unfair, giving the courthouse the excuse to deny Hamer and her fellow volunteers the right to vote. It was on the way back home when Hamer and the other volunteers were pulled over by a highway patrolman and fined $100 because their bus was too yellow. The passengers paid the toll and returned home. Hamer returned home that night to one of her daughters running to her. The plantation owner, Marlowe, had heard Hamer had left to register to vote and was angry. He told her husband and then Hamer herself that Hamer would either have to withdraw her registration or she would be kicked out of the plantation, lose her job, lose where she was living. And she told him plainly, I went to register for me, not for you. This is my choice. And she had to leave that night. Hamer stayed with many different people until she could find a place of her own to stay. One night, the house she was staying in was shot at. But if Hamer was intimidated, she didn't show it. In fact, she just kept fighting for her and her people's right to vote. On one such attempt to register again in June of 1963, Hamer and some other women were on their way back home from Charleston, South Carolina, when they stopped at a whites-only restaurant. They were arrested and brought to a jailhouse in Winona, Mississippi. The women were interrogated, beaten, cursed at, and harassed in a number of ways. Hamer left the jailhouse with permanent kidney damage and a blood clot in one eye. And yet Hamer continued to fight. In 1964, Hamer co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, to fight against Mississippi's all-white delegation. At the Democratic National Convention that year, Hamer and many other MFDP members fought to be recognized as a true delegation. The convention was televised, and when it was Hamer's turn to speak, President Lyndon Johnson interrupted with a televised press conference of no big importance to guarantee Hamer had no airtime.
The president, Lyndon Johnson, he's not afraid of Martin Luther King's testimony. He's afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony.
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connally, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy.
The interruption, however, did not have its desired effect. Because the President of the United States had interrupted Hamer's speech, news stations were saying, hey, this is a story. He took this off air for a reason. There's something there. And so they picked it up and kept replaying it. And so instead of never airing at all, Hamer's speech was played multiple times. And not only because it was played multiple times, but with the knowledge that it was taken off air for a silly announcement, it gave Hamer and her fellow MFDP members more publicity for what they were trying to do. And Hamer poured her soul out in that speech. She expressed the difficulties of just trying to vote and how bad that situation became just because of the color of her skin, something she couldn't control.
All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook?
It was by 1968 when the delegations became equal. In her lifetime, Hamer also organized Freedom Summer, which brought both black and white college students together to help register African Americans to vote in the South. In that same year, she announced that she would be running for the Mississippi House of Representatives. However, she was not allowed on the ballot. The next year, in 1965, Hamer and 2 other women protested the 1964 Mississippi House election, becoming the first black women to stand in the U.S. Congress. 1971, Hamer helped found the National Women's Political Caucus. She also assisted black farmers by beginning a pig bank that provided farmers free pigs and created the Freedom Farm Cooperative, or FFC, to help African Americans own and share land. In 1971, she also ran for state senator. Hamer was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1976. Even when she was in the hospital, Hamer refused to let her daughter see her weak. It was on March 14, 1977, when Hamer passed away at the age of 59. On her tombstone, her famous quote, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired," is engraved. Hamer gave many inspirational speeches in her time.
Give us a chance to be young men, respected as a man. As we know, this country was built on the black backs of black people across this country. And if we don't have it, you ain't gonna have it either, because we gonna tear it up. That's what they saying. And people ought to understand that. I don't see why they don't understand it. They know what they've done to us.
She would also break into song during protests or speeches to keep everyone's spirits up. Her singing was part of what made her so well known. She was funny, loving, and caring. Hamer was also religious and loved her family. Some of her famous quotes include, "Nobody's free until everybody's free," and "If I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I'm not backing off." Fannie Lou Hamer was definitely a hero.
It's the life mine.